Something happened inside the U.S. Saudi relationship during the Iran war that nobody is saying plainly out loud yet. Not because it is classified, not because nobody knows, but because saying it plainly forces a reckoning with a reality that both Washington and Riyadh would prefer to approach quietly, carefully, and without the kind of public confrontation that would be impossible to walk back. The reality is this: the model that has defined American military power in the Gulf for more than 3 decades, the forward basing model, American troops and aircraft and warships stationed on Gulf soil as a tripwire deterrent against exactly the kind of Iranian aggression that has now materialized, did not work. It did not deter Iran. It made the Gulf states more vulnerable, not less. It turned Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia into a target that Iran hit with ballistic missiles and drones at least 6 times, destroying an irreplaceable E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft, damaging multiple KC-135 tankers, wounding more than 24 American service members in a single week. It rendered 13 American bases across Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE so comprehensively targeted, and so consistently struck that satellite imagery openly available to the public shows what military analysts are now calling uninhabitable conditions. And it created a dynamic that nobody in the 50-year history of American military basing in the Gulf had fully wargamed: that the presence of American forces on Gulf soil does not protect the Gulf states from Iran. It implicates them in the war. It makes them co-targets. And it gives Iran justification, which Iran has used to devastating effect, to treat every Gulf monarchy as part of the American military infrastructure it is striking. MBS understands this. He understood it before the first missile landed. And the hidden timeline that is now being quietly assembled between Washington and Riyadh, in conversations that are not being announced and not being leaked, is one of the most consequential strategic recalibrations in the history of the American presence in the Middle East. It is not an ultimatum in the dramatic sense. It is a recognition, shared on both sides but unspoken publicly, that after the Iran war, the old arrangement cannot hold in its current form. And figuring out what replaces it is the defining security question of the post-war Gulf. Start with what actually happened to American forces on Saudi soil during the war, because the public record is damning enough on its own, without any classified additions. An Iranian ballistic missile scored a direct hit on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. Air Force hub hosting E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft, E-11A communications aircraft, tankers, and fighter aircraft. Prince Sultan Air Base, 600 kilometers from the Iranian coast, deep in the Saudi interior. It was chosen as the primary American air hub in Saudi Arabia specifically because of its distance from Iran. The geography was supposed to provide protection. It did not. Satellite imagery showed a heat signature at the location, possibly caused by flames and hot gases and smoke towering from the area. Satellite imagery confirms a U.S. Air Force KC-135 Stratotanker was destroyed and several others possibly damaged. An E-3 Sentry AWACS plane was also damaged. Photos posted on social media showed the extent of the damage to U.S. Air Force E-3G Sentry 81-005 following the drone and missile attack. The attack also damaged several KC-135s. An E-3 Sentry. This aircraft is not just expensive, it is irreplaceable in the short term. The E-3 Sentry is the airborne warning and control system that provides real-time battlefield surveillance, command authority, and communication links for air operations across a theater of war. There are only 31 of them left in the U.S. Air Force's active inventory. The Air Force has been flying these aircraft since the 1970s, and is in the middle of a modernization program that will not produce replacements until well into the 2030s. Destroying or severely damaging one of them in a missile strike on a supposedly secure base hundreds of kilometers from the Iranian border is not just a tactical loss. It is an irreversible strategic degradation. And it happened because Iran, which has been told for decades that attacking American forces in the Gulf would bring devastating retaliation, calculated that it could absorb that retaliation and still impose costs. More than 24 U.S. troops were wounded in Iranian attacks on a Saudi airbase in the past week. Iran fired 6 ballistic missiles and 29 drones at Saudi Arabia's Prince Sultan Air Base in an attack that wounded at least 15 troops in one strike alone. 6 ballistic missiles and 29 drones in a single coordinated strike on an American air base deep inside the territory of America's primary Gulf ally. This is not harassment. This is not symbolic signaling. This is Iran demonstrating that it can conduct complex, multi-vector attacks on hardened military facilities at strategic depth inside the Arabian Peninsula, absorb whatever American response follows, and keep doing it. Bases such as Camp Arifjan and Ali al-Salam in Kuwait, or Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, have become key targets. Satellite imagery that is finally available to the public shows that all 13 U.S. bases have become uninhabitable. Their proximity to critical infrastructure further amplifies the risk, as attacks on military facilities can spill over into civilian and economic domains. All 13, not some, not the ones closest to Iran. All 13 American bases across the Gulf region have been rendered effectively uninhabitable by the combination of Iranian ballistic missile strikes, cruise missile attacks, and drone swarms that characterized the war's first weeks. The American military model in the Gulf, which was predicated on the assumption that the threat of overwhelming retaliation would deter Iran from striking American facilities, has been empirically falsified. Iran struck. Iran kept striking. And the bases, which were supposed to be the bedrock of American deterrence in the region, became the mechanism through which Iran targeted the Gulf states that hosted them. Gulf states universally communicated to Washington before February 28, 2026, that they would not permit their territory to be used for operations against Iran, and Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry subsequently confirmed this commitment. Iran, the GCC states calculated, would reciprocate this neutrality. They were catastrophically wrong. On February 28th, Iranian missiles and drones began striking not only U.S. military facilities in Gulf states, but civilian targets, hotels, airports, and energy infrastructure in Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Dubai, and Kuwait. The Middle East Council on Global Affairs characterized Iran's position as treating the Gulf states as an inherent part of the military landscape because of the presence of American bases, regardless of their stated neutrality. This is the sentence that changes everything about how the Gulf monarchies now calculate the cost and benefit of hosting American troops. Iran did not care that Saudi Arabia had refused to let America use its airspace for strikes. Iran did not care that the Gulf states had publicly declared their neutrality. Iran had a strategic logic that treated American military basing in the Gulf as an inherent act of belligerency, regardless of the host state's political posture. The presence of American forces was enough. The flags on the planes, the passports of the pilots, the nationalities of the commanders, none of that mattered to Tehran. If American assets were on your soil was part of the war, and your oil infrastructure, your airports, your hotels, your civilian facilities near American bases, all legitimate targets. Close relations with the U.S., whether it's U.S. military bases or promoting normalization with Israel, or enforcing U.S. sanctions or maintaining the dollar peg of their currencies, is less a benefit now than actually a liability. While the last 7 weeks of war have made it clear that the Gulf states can no longer fully rely on the U.S. as a security partner, they may start looking to Israel as a security partner. Less a benefit than a liability, that is the assessment from the Quincy Institute, and it reflects a conversation happening inside Saudi strategic planning circles that nobody in Riyadh is going to publicly confirm, but that the evidence makes unmistakable. The entire logic of the American basing model was that American forces on Gulf soil would deter Iran from attacking. That logic has been tested for the first time under real wartime conditions. It failed, not because American forces were weak, not because Iran was stronger than anyone expected, but because Iran had adopted an asymmetric strategy specifically designed to circumvent the deterrence model, attack the bases, accept the retaliation, impose costs on the host states, and trust that the political pressure generated by those costs would eventually constrain American action more than Iranian military capability ever could. In late January, Gulf states reportedly blocked military base and airspace access to the U.S. over fears of Iranian retaliation. The United States has maintained a military presence in the Middle East since the early Cold War era, expanding it significantly after the Gulf War and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, maintaining military facilities across at least 19 sites in the Middle East. They blocked access before the war even started. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman all communicated to Washington in late January 2026 that they would not permit the use of their territory or airspace for offensive military operations against Iran. This was an extraordinary step. The Gulf states have hosted American forces for decades and have consistently, if sometimes quietly, cooperated with American military operations in the region. The fact that they all simultaneously refused in advance of the war's outbreak tells you something critical about the calculation they were already making in January. They knew what was coming. They knew Iran would retaliate against the Gulf if American operations were launched from Gulf soil, and they drew a line in sand. But the line did not protect them, because Iran drew its own line, and Iran's line was, American military presence anywhere in the Gulf makes the host state a belligerent. On March 2nd, 2026, during the Iran War, Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense announced that 5 hostile drones were intercepted and destroyed near Prince Sultan Base. The incident followed a separate drone strike earlier the same day on Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery. The same day, Ras Tanura refinery and Prince Sultan Air Base, both struck on March the 2nd. Iran was not distinguishing between the American military infrastructure and the Saudi civilian oil infrastructure. It was hitting both simultaneously, and the strikes kept coming. Satellite images captured on March 1st show smoke rising from a compound where a radar shelter associated with a THAAD battery had previously been located. The tent-like structure used to house the radar antenna appears badly charred, and debris is scattered across the surrounding area. The THAAD radar, one of the most capable early warning systems America has deployed anywhere in the world, sitting on Saudi soil to protect Saudi and American interests, targeted and hit in the war's first days. Iran's strikes were not random. They were specifically designed to blind the air defense network. Destroy the radar that tells you what is coming, and everything that comes after the radar goes dark arrives undetected. Now look at the strategic position MBS finds himself in after all of this, because the war has produced a calculation that is fundamentally different from anything the Crown Prince was working with before February 28th. Gulf states will pursue a more proactive approach to building their deterrence via capabilities rather than alliances, a shift that implies accelerated indigenous defense industrialization, diversification of security partnerships beyond the American umbrella, and a more assertive regional security architecture. Deterrence via capabilities rather than alliances. This phrase is the quiet articulation of a strategic revolution. The Gulf states have spent 50 years building their security around an American alliance. They have bought American weapons, hosted American bases, coordinated American military operations, and accepted the trade-offs that came with deep American entanglement, the political constraints, the Israeli alignment requirements, the domestic opposition to visible American military presence on Muslim holy soil. They accepted all of it because the deterrence model was supposed to work, and now they have seen, in real time in satellite imagery that is publicly available, and casualty figures that trickled out despite Saudi attempts to manage the information, that the deterrence model does not work the way it was supposed to. Prior to its June 2025 and March 2026 conflicts with Iran, the U.S. evacuated most personnel from its bases in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Iraq. No matter how many Patriot missile systems the U.S. deploys, U.S. troops stationed so close to the front will be vulnerable to ballistic missiles and drones. Even when the vulnerability of personnel is not the problem, basing in the Middle East and Turkey gives host countries a de facto veto over missions. The American Enterprise Institute saying the United States should close its Middle East bases, not a pacifist think tank, not an anti-war advocacy group. The American Enterprise Institute, one of the most hawkish foreign policy institutions in Washington, saying publicly in April 2026 that the basing model is broken and it is time for the U.S. to leave. The intellectual infrastructure in Washington that has historically defended and championed the forward basing model is cracking. And if it is cracking in Washington, it is cracking even more severely in Riyadh, where the physical consequences of the model's failure were felt in the form of ballistic missiles landing on oil infrastructure and American air bases on Saudi territory. Its posture underscores a broader lesson. Security partnerships need not require permanent basing, and maintaining a degree of strategic distance from U.S. military infrastructure can reduce exposure to retaliation while preserving political and diplomatic maneuverability. The evidence is increasingly clear. U.S. bases have not protected Gulf states from Iranian aggression, and in some cases may have made them more vulnerable. Recognizing this reality is the first step toward building an alternative and potentially more sustainable security architecture. U.S. bases may have made the Gulf states more vulnerable. This is not a fringe argument anymore. It is becoming the mainstream analytical conclusion of think tanks from across the political spectrum that are looking at the satellite imagery, counting the missile strikes, reading the casualty reports, and concluding that the 50-year model needs to be reconsidered. And here is where MBS's position becomes extraordinarily complex, because he does not want to be seen as expelling American forces. He does not want the diplomatic fallout of a public break with Washington. He does not want to lose the $142 billion defense package, the F-35 deal, the major non-NATO ally designation, civil nuclear cooperation agreement, the AI chip access, the Patriot replenishment pipeline that he still desperately needs. All of that is conditioned on the U.S. Saudi security relationship remaining intact. The broader significance of the F-35 deal lies not in the aircraft itself, but in what it signals about the U.S. Saudi relationship. The sale was announced alongside Saudi Arabia's designation as a major non-NATO ally, a status that unlocks access to the most advanced American weapon systems and deepens the institutional bonds between the two militaries. The Trump-MBS alliance that produced this deal has been the most consequential factor in Saudi Arabia's strategic position during the Iran crisis. MBS needs the relationship. He needs the weapons. He needs the technology. He needs the nuclear cooperation. He needs the American market access for Vision 2030's investment ambitions. formally breaking with Washington is not an option he can exercise without destroying the architecture of his entire modernization program. But he also cannot continue to host American forces under the current arrangement because the current arrangement has proven to be a security liability rather than a security asset. The bases on Saudi soil made Saudi Arabia a target. The American presence in the Gulf, instead of deterring Iranian aggression, became the justification Iran used for that aggression. Statements attributed to Saudi officials, as well as alleged communications between Saudi Crown Prince and U.S. President Donald Trump, have been interpreted as indicating tacit support for the ongoing military action against Iran. While Saudi sources have denied claims that Riyadh encouraged prolonging the war, such reports highlight the dual-track nature of what Saudi policy could be: publicly cautious, yet potentially more assertive in private. The dual-track nature. This has been MBS's operating mode throughout the crisis: public neutrality, private advocacy for maximal American action against Iran, public opposition to bases being used for offensive operations, private encouragement of those operations happening from nearby, public calls for ceasefire, private lobbying for regime change, and now public maintenance of the alliance framework, private recalculation of what the alliance should look like going forward. Saudi Arabia's defense minister Khalid bin Salman said in a closed-door briefing in Washington that Trump should take military action against Iran or risk strengthening the regime. However, government policy was to not allow use of its airspace or bases for attacks. Government policy, one thing; defense minister, another. The same kingdom, in the same week, publicly refusing base access for offensive operations against Iran and privately telling Washington those operations should happen. This structural contradiction, wanting America to fight Iran without wanting to visibly host the fight, is the contradiction that the war has now made untenable. You cannot have America bomb Iran without being implicated in the bombing. Iran made that perfectly clear by striking Saudi infrastructure regardless of Saudi neutrality declarations. What MBS is now building, quietly and without public announcement, is a new security architecture for Saudi Arabia that has several key features. First, a dramatic acceleration of indigenous Saudi military capability. The kingdom is spending over $75 billion annually on defense. That spending is increasingly directed toward domestic production capacity, sovereign deterrent systems that Saudi Arabia controls rather than depends on American willingness to supply, and the kind of strike capabilities that the American relationship has historically constrained for fear of regional instability. Second, a diversification of security partnerships. Pakistan sent 13,000 troops to King Abdulaziz Air Base under the Saudi-Pak Defense Agreement during the war, providing a force that was simultaneously Sunni Muslim, politically neutral relative to the U.S. Israel-Iran triangle, and actually present on Saudi soil when the missiles were falling. This arrangement suited MBS precisely because it provided security without the political complications that come with American presence. Third, a quiet conversation with Washington about what the basing relationship should look like after the war, in which the visible footprint of American forces on Saudi soil is reduced, the operational mode shifts from forward basing toward over-the-horizon capability, and the formal defense relationship is maintained through weapons sales and training missions rather than through thousands of American uniformed personnel stationed at bases that Iran now has targeting data for. U.S. aircraft today have greater range, and amphibious assault vessels transporting F-35s and Ospreys render many bases obsolete. The Pentagon basing map must reflect 21st century realities, not 20th century legacies. National interest requires bases to serve clear objectives, and neither comes saddled with caveats nor constrain diplomatic action when host countries go bad. 21st century realities. This is the American framing that makes the Saudi conversation easier. Because if the Pentagon is independently concluding that the forward basing model needs to be replaced by over-the-horizon posture, by naval platforms that can project power without being physically present on ally soil, by longer-range strike assets that do not need to be stationed within Iranian ballistic missile range, then the shift is not a Saudi expulsion of American forces. It is a mutual strategic evolution that serves both sides' interests. MBS can pursue it without having to publicly break with Trump. Washington can embrace it without having to admit that the current model failed. Both sides can frame it as modernization rather than retreat. It's very unlikely that we're ever going to go back and put our Fifth Fleet back in Bahrain. The bases around the region are suffering real damage. The Iran war will certainly spur conversation over whether partners need or want these huge bases anymore. Very unlikely. That is the phrase from someone who has seen pictures of what happened to naval support activity Bahrain, the home of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, after Iranian missiles hit it. Very unlikely that America goes back to the pre-war footprint. And if America does not go back to the pre-war footprint in Bahrain, it will not go back to the pre-war footprint in Qatar, in Kuwait, in the UAE, and the logic that reduces those footprints applies with equal force to Saudi Arabia, where Prince Sultan Air Base was struck repeatedly, where an irreplaceable AWACS was destroyed, where more than 24 American service members were wounded in a single week. The hidden timeline is not a formal diplomatic document. It is not a written ultimatum. It is the quiet recognition, shared by everyone with real information about what the war revealed, that the arrangement that has defined Gulf security since the early 1970s has been empirically invalidated and must be replaced by something different. MBS's final warning to Washington is not delivered in the form of a threatening statement or a public demand. It is delivered in the form of satellite imagery of a destroyed E-3 Sentry at Prince Sultan Air Base, in the form of the defense minister telling closed-door Washington briefings that America should fight Iran while the government publicly refuses to provide bases for that fight, in the form of Pakistan sending 13,000 troops as an alternative security partner, in the form of the Sovereign Wealth Fund accelerating its investments in domestic defense industry, in the form of the F-35 deal being framed not as an expression of alliance loyalty, but as an insurance policy, in the form of every move MBS makes being calculated to maintain the access to American technology and weapons while reducing the vulnerability to Iranian retaliation that comes from hosting American operational forces. The strategic implications for Saudi Arabia are particularly complex. Riyadh arguably stands to gain most from an Iran reduced to strategic irrelevance. Iranian hegemonic ambitions have been the single greatest obstacle to Saudi regional primacy. Yet the war has also demonstrated that the Gulf states, for all their wealth and American backing, remain structurally exposed. The gap between defending fixed positions with American-built Patriot batteries and projecting offensive military power across a hostile theater remains vast. Structurally exposed, despite $75 billion a year in defensive spending. Despite Patriot batteries and THAAD systems and American guarantees. Structurally exposed in a way that the war made undeniable and the satellite imagery confirmed. And the man who spent years telling Trump in private phone calls to bomb Iran, who lobbied for regime change and for ground troops to seize Iranian oil fields, who built his entire security calculus around American military power, eliminating the Iranian threat permanently. That man is now looking at the wreckage of Prince Sultan Air Base and calculating whether the arrangement that produced that wreckage is the arrangement he wants to maintain. The answer he is quietly moving toward, in conversations that are not yet public and may never become public in explicit terms, is not in its current form, not with this footprint, not with these rules of engagement that let Iran justify striking Saudi civilian and oil infrastructure because American planes are parked at Saudi air bases. The hidden timeline says American forces do not leave Saudi Arabia tomorrow. They do not leave this year in a dramatic headline-generating withdrawal, but the arrangement changes. The footprint shrinks. The operational posture shifts from forward to over the horizon. The weapons sales and training missions continue. The strategic relationship persists, but the visible American military presence on Saudi soil, the presence that turned Prince Sultan Air Base into a ballistic missile target, shrinks to a level that Iran can no longer use as justification for treating Saudi Arabia as part of the American military infrastructure it is at war with. That is MBS's final warning to Washington, not in words, in the undeniable logic of what the war revealed. And Washington, looking at its own satellite imagery of 13 uninhabitable bases and an inventory that is now one irreplaceable AWACS lighter, already knows it.